There is no real magic to composting. There's a little science to it, but it's really not much more complicated than baking a cake, except that composting is a controlled decomposition. So it's, I always laugh and call it controlled rot, because that's sort of what it is. Just like aging meat or doing wine, that it is an aging process, and it's a control of that microbial action that trying to make sure you've got the proper conditions and the proper outcomes from those conditions is what composting is all about. So you're going to have to give me a moment because I have a soapbox about composting, and I want to climb up on it for just a bit. In 6 years, with the last 6 years, we have filled up at least 3 landfills with the municipal solid waste coming out of Davidson County. They are 1 in Kentucky and 2 in Tennessee. Middle Point Landfill out in the Murfreesboro area is currently taking about 50% of our waste, and it's going to be filled up in the next 5 to 8 years. Now, I know for the last 5 years they've been saying it's going to be filled up in 5 years, but the fact is if we look at it, it has a real potential to be maxed out in that length of time. We are now sending solid waste to places like Shelby County, which is over 200 miles away, and Decatur County in Georgia, which is 475 miles away. This is just our trash. And the state of Tennessee is no longer permitting new builds for landfills. That means that we have to either find someplace new to go or get the communities where our landfills are convinced that it's okay for them to go taller with their Mount Trashmore developments. That means it could be that as early as 2026, we're going to be exporting all of our trash. And we're closing down landfills at the same time that the Davidson County populations and those around greater Nashville area are going up at a rate that's larger than it's ever been in the past. So, on top of that, Republic Services says that 2/3 of what they get at their landfill doorstep is all organics, compostable materials. So things like paper, food waste, yard waste, wood, all of those things that could be composted and allow us to keep our landfills functional for a lot longer. So the first benefit of composting is that we reduce waste going to landfills. That's my soapbox. I'm now off of it, and we'll talk about the other benefits. So compost enriches the soil structure and nutrient content, and it helps control the pH. And if you're a society that's built on limestone like our area, the pH can always be tricky in our soils. Certain organisms that are found in compost protect against soil-borne diseases and plant pathogens just by upcycling all of your yard waste and food waste. It helps retain moisture. If you heard my conversation about rain gardens, you know that I'm big on that because it reduces water runoff. The soil organisms and how you get that compost turned creates pores and spaces for water to be able to stay there and infiltrate longer, and it has a great storage capacity for water. The humus, which is the key material in compost, functions as the glue that binds the soil together, which means it's much more resistant to erosion. The more organic matter that's present, the more resistant to erosion the soil becomes. So that's a big thing when we've got so much clay. You get that compost in there, and it allows both the water and the nutrients to hang around for a long time. It reduces the need for synthetic fertilizers, and it helps filter out excess nutrients such as the phosphorus and nitrogens that can contribute to aquatic dead zones out in our rivers and our lakes. And compost creates a controlled, slow release fertilizer. And it releases that phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and other micronutrients that are critical to plant growth and survival. And these are less prone to being lost through the leaching that happens with synthetic fertilizers. So, all good stuff. At my house, at the Blue Horse Farmette, I have a hierarchy of what we do, at least with our food waste. The first thing, of course, is that I'm going to eat it, whether it's at home or a restaurant. But whether it's at home or a restaurant, it comes home with me in some sort of container for them being fed down my little food chain. So if it's a protein, dogs or cats get it, if they're willing to eat it. After that, if it's a vegetable or a fruit, then either my horses or my chickens get it, depending on what it is. Horses are going to go after the carrots and the apples and watermelon. Everything else goes to the chickens. And after that, it all goes to the compost pile. So whether it's coffee grounds, eggshells, food that's a little bit off, citrus, onions, garlic, chicken bedding, manure, yard and garden waste, old corrugated cardboard, paper, that all goes into the compost pile. The things that don't are proteins, fats, dairy, except for those eggshells. And I can tell you they're a great source for calcium. So if you're not feeding them to the chickens, you ought to be feeding them to the compost pile. So I said it was a little bit like baking a cake, because it is. A cake takes dry ingredients, you put in wet ingredients, you blend it around, and then you're going to cook it at a certain temperature for a certain period of time. Well, compost is the same way. You've got to get 4 elements sort of in balance at that optimum Goldilocks range to come up with the best compost that you can get. So let's look at each one of the things. Oxygen, honestly, you can put oxygen in by turning, which means it's an aerobic process, or you can simply put it in a pile and have an anaerobic process. That the biggest disadvantage to putting it in a pile and not turning it is that it's going to take a lot longer for it to cook out to your compost, and it's going to be smelly. There's not really a way to get around that, because that's what you get without adding your air. So pile it up, leave it in a pile, don't do anything to it, and in 6 to 18 months, you're going to have some compost. But in the meantime, you get the lovely side effects of that rotten egg smell, the skunk smell, the ammonia, the acetic acid, all of those things that come from feeling like you're more rotting and not near as much control to it. And it does produce methane gas. Hopefully everyone knows that that's not good. That's about 20 times worse than just carbon dioxide out in the atmosphere. So if you do it the quick way or the aerobic way, that means you're only going to get sort of an earthy smell, not those others. And if you turn it daily, you can have, if you've got your other elements in balance, you can have compost in 2 weeks. If you don't mind it taking a little bit longer, you don't really have the time to turn, or you don't have an immediate need for it, then in that first 10 to 15 days, if you'll turn it about every other day, then you can have a good balanced compost in as little as 2 months. And if you forget to turn it, every other day, and you get that smell, then all you have to do is introduce air, get a garden fork or a shovel, something, and get that pile turned over, and you can knock those smells down by simply doing that. And there are different ways of turning it. I have myself used the 3-bin process with a sort of a fencing mode. And you don't have to buy it. You can use pallets if you can get some old used pallets and just nail them together, and you can use that for your bin. For smaller amounts, and what I use now out at the farm because I feed a lot of my compost to my chickens, is you can get one of those rolling or flipping tumbleweed type thing. The one that I use in particular at my house is the middle one that has an upright stand. I have found that because it has an end-over-end agitation action, it really blends it. When I've looked at those that are just sort of rolling, they don't distribute that heat from the center of the compost, and they don't distribute the materials or the moisture as well as I like it to be. So I just have sort of a personal preference. So let's look at that moisture. Goldilocks area is 40 to 60%. And what you need is to have enough moisture to feed those little fungal threads without making it so soggy that you compress it and drive all the air out. And if it gets, if it's a lot of rain like it was just recently, or if it gets really dry like we often have at late August and September, then you can cover it with plastic. That keeps more rain from getting out, and it keeps moisture in that you've already gotten in there to help keep it a little bit more balanced. So if you're in doubt, take a handful, squeeze it. What you're looking for is a wrung out sponge type consistency. If it's dry, it's just going to sit there. If it's too wet, it's going to be a soggy, nasty mess. So what do you do if it's a soggy, nasty mess? Add more carbon or more dry material and blend that in, get it turned in so it helps absorb that moisture. And if it's, not dry enough, it's too dry, then simply add water. And this is where, I know a lot of you are going to say, yeah, but size matters. You need to have those particles as small as you can. So if you've got a lot of leaves from the fall, don't put those in as whole leaves. Run your lawnmower over it a couple of times to get it broken down. Otherwise, they can mat together and they don't break down quickly and they don't absorb the water. You can end up with a lot of striated material, and that's not going to compost easily or quickly. So shred your branches. Branches add good, nice ways to get air into the compost, and otherwise make sure that you've got those leaves cut up as best you can. Smaller is better. So carbon and nitrogen blend. You're looking for a 30 to 1, 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen in order to get, those are your dry materials and your egg that you're putting in your cake. It's like the sugar that you put in a sourdough starter. That's what feeds the little microbes that are in your compost, and it's the building block and the energy source for everything that's in the compost. The most likely reason your compost is out of whack is because your carbon and your nitrogen ratio is out of whack. So you cannot just do banana leaves from your banana plant, Tyler, or just food waste.
Wow,
you've got to get more things in there. Well, you were asking about that earlier.
Yes.
So the carbon and nitrogen is often talked about as referred to as brown and green, and you've got all sorts of sources for your carbon sources. In fact, this is where I tell people, become a leaf thief in the fall. What you want to do is all those crazy people that bag up their leaves, just be unashamed and go and snatch those off the street and bring them to your house so that you have feedstock later on in the year. So straw, wood chips and shavings, pine needles, sawdust, which is a really nice high carbon source, wood ashes, not charcoal, cardboard, non-slick paper because you don't want all that ink, and dried leaves are all really good sources. And basically, if you can find the ratio that's listed for a particular item, what you're looking for to count as carbon, it's got to be a 50 to 1 or higher ratio. And I say that because I'll show you the difference in just a minute. So here are your ratios on some most common items, and you can see that you hit the jackpot if you use sawdust or cardboard. It just doesn't take as much to sort of get that nitrogen knocked down a little bit. And I know that not very many people have newspapers anymore, but you still do have mixed paper. I'm one of those people that says if it's a soy-based ink, it's good to use. If it is a colored paper, I probably wouldn't use it. Although if it's not very much, I'm not concerned about it. I use mine both in my vegetable garden and in all the other plants that I plant, so I don't mind if it's not strictly organic. So, nitrogen.
Terry.
Yes.
Sawdust. Probably not good to have sawdust from treated lumber. Right?
Oh, no. Now, I will say this. I'm glad you brought that up.
Sure.
Pressure-treated lumber isn't what it used to be. A lot of you probably don't remember when it first started being called yellowwood. Old pressure-treated lumber had formaldehyde in it as part of the pressure treating process. All the new pressure-treated lumber doesn't have that element anymore. So you can use those to build your raised bed gardens, but no, I probably would not add that into my compost if you're using it for vegetable. If you're just using it for trees and shrubs, then it probably would not be a problem, just because it doesn't have that nasty in it anymore.
Question from Emily.
Hi, Emily.
So why not charcoal? Like after I grill, I wouldn't want to put that in my compost.
Not if it is a bagged charcoal. If it's something like what you get for the green egg, big green egg cooker, which is a natural charcoal. It doesn't have lighter fluid, and it's not been turned into a briquette. They use some adhesion elements in those briquettes to get them those clever little sizes and shapes, and those additives are what you don't want in. So if you get a natural charcoal, which looks like pieces of wood, then that's not going to be a problem. But most people don't get that, which is why I say sort of blanket statement of you don't want to use charcoal. Okay, that get you? Hopefully so. And here are the nitrogen ratios on these other materials, and you can see that all of them have some carbon, but not as much, and those are all considered that high in nitrogen, so it has nothing to do with color. So you'll see that coffee grounds are on there. And yes, those are dark. That doesn't count as brown. So it's not the color of the material. It's what the material is. And I thought it was very interesting that human and pet hair is really good. And it also adds magnesium, which is a really important trace element. Let me go back up here.
Does human and animal hair break down about the same as the other ingredients?
Yes, it does. So it works just great. If you do your own grooming at the house, whether it's you, your kids, or your animals, then that is definitely something to be able to add in. Temperature. Remember, you bake your cake at a certain length of time at a certain temperature. Well, here is that golden area of what your temperature needs to be, because if it's any colder than that, 90 degrees, it's not going to kill the weed seeds and the disease that can be present. So and you can put weed seeds in, it's going to be hard to keep it out. I wouldn't use anything that has a really heavy seed pod. Like, honestly, I wouldn't use a dandelion flower that's already out in the puffball stage. But I don't mind using those other things because I'm going to chop them up into smaller pieces if I can and make sure that it gets that temperature. So the 90 degrees, you put your hand on it like in the center of the pile or the bin, and it should be warm to the touch. Up on that higher end, it's not really a touch and scream, but I can tell you that if you can hold your hand on that pile for more than 10 seconds, it's probably below 140. I found out sort of the hard way. It was the best place for me to put one of my last compost piles was in behind my chicken coop. It was in the shade, which means that it was a really tough time except in the fall and the winter for me to get that pile hot enough, and it just took a lot longer for it to cook out and bake properly. So if you've got a spot that's a little bit sunnier, that's going to just help with the temperature control. And I'll give you a tip about what to do during the winter composting a little bit later on. So let me sort of pull all these different elements together because there were just 4. So become a leaf thief. Take advantage of everybody else putting out their pine needles or their leaves so that you've got a feedstock for later on in the year, especially if you've only got conifers that don't shed their needles. Up the oxygen by turning it. You don't have to turn it like every other day. It's just a matter of if you keep it turned, it will not smell, which is, for me, sort of the biggest thing. Get your moisture right. So you're looking for the wrung out sponge and it sort of clumps together without it dripping water out of it when you squeeze it. And that's going to be a lot of reliance on how quickly it does that and how it absorbs by how big the particle size is. So try to keep the particle size as small as you can. Make sure you get your brown and green or your carbon and nitrogen ratios as correct as you can. Can I tell you that, and that means you need 30 parts of cardboard per 1 part of food waste? Not really. I will give you some guidance if you need more information on exactly how many parts of what you want to put in. And then get it hot, somewhere between warm and scream. And a good way in the fall or in the winter is at night, you can cover it with an old piece of carpet or bubble wrap to try and keep some of that heat in. And if you know it's going to be frosty cold like it was just a couple of weeks ago, then you can fill up a plastic milk jug with screaming hot water, cap it off, and then bury it in the center of the pile, and that'll keep it going. So make sure you get a countertop collection spot. I've used a couple of different elements. This is my current go-to because it's small enough that I'm not going to have it on my counter for a long time. It's got a ring that is a sealing element, so if it does start to smell, it doesn't get out, and those little fruit flies that come in on your fresh fruit doesn't have a chance to get in and repopulate themselves. And then I put a plastic bag inside just so when it's filled, I can take the plastic bag out and take it down to the compost pile and then rinse the bag out, use it again. Keeps me from having to wash out my little compost collector every time I empty the compost out into my composting station. So that's a handy dandy.
We got a question as far as the winter aspect. Any way to add too much wood ash? I have a winter supply of ash. I don't know what to do.
The wood ash, the problem is it also can pop your pH. So it can become really alkaline and you've got to be, or really acid. I'd have to look it up now, but you can end up with problem from that. So I would not use all of it. Now you can certainly broadcast it if you've got a yard. You can sort of broadcast that so that it helps infiltrate in, but you would not want to really concentrate it in your compost pile. I think you might have a problem with that.
And somebody here mentioned Vitamix makes a fertilizer maker, like it's kind of a tabletop.
Yes.
Yeah.
There are a number of places you can look up, like countertop compost or in-home compost, and they have not just compost collection containers, but they have actual composting units for inside the house. So if any of you know people that say, oh, I can't collect my food waste and compost it because I live in an apartment, not true. They can, and they can use it in their houseplants if they have houseplants. I've also got some other resources for you if you think all of this is a little overwhelming for you. So I've got a little slide later on to be able to give you some other options that you can use.
Now that setup would probably be better for that application like you were talking about, because like if you were trying to create enough compost to cover your garden, your raised bed, it probably wouldn't be enough.
No, absolutely not.
And be very more energy intensive than just breaking it down outside.
Yeah. Now I have a personal choice that people say, well, I recycle all of my paper. I recycle all my cardboard. Well, good for you. I'm an adamant recycler, but recycling is called recycling because you have to ship it somewhere on a truck. You have to collect it for I don't know how long before you then use chemicals and heat and electricity to transform that back into another product. Composting happens, as a rule, at your house. It doesn't take energy other than your own energy to transform that, and it creates life. I just think that that's a really good way to look at it on what your priorities are. If it's still something that you say, well, recycling's just easier, as long as you don't throw it away, I'm 100% behind you on that element. So let's take a look at, that's one of those other things that once you start your compost pile, don't completely clean it out once you've used most of it in the garden, because you've got a great little seed stock right there of the fungal spores and threads and those mycorrhiza that you're going to want. If you'll use that to seed into your new compost pile that you're working from, that really makes a difference on how quickly it breaks down. So
we do have a question here.
Yeah.
Can you please elaborate more on the carbon to nitrogen ratio, like in a general case, if cardboard was to kitchen waste or something?
I've heard some people, there's always a debate. It's like using citrus and onions in your compost pile. I've heard a lot of home composters say don't use it, and yet Cornell University and UK say it's perfectly fine as long as you don't do a lot of it. If I were to bring up a Word document, would that show up on the screen?
It would have to be
out on the desktop. So that's perfect.
Yeah.
Give me just a second here because I pulled up a document. So if you were going to put like tree leaves and grass clippings.
Terry, I don't see it if you pulled it up.
I didn't because I didn't put it out on my desktop.
Okay.
So 3 parts tree leaves, your carbon, to 1 part grass clippings. So you can look at it as cups or gallons or shovelfuls, however you want to sort of look at it. If you had a little farm, straw to manure ratio would be 1 part straw to 2 parts manure. If you were going to do manure and newspaper, it's going to be 5 parts manure to 1 part newspaper or mixed paper. Because even though the manure's got nitrogen in it, it's basically broken down hay and other grains. So you've got a pretty good blend there already targeting that target area. So that's sort of you end up with things that are 50 to 1 plus 19 to 1 and 20 to 1 plus 80 to 1 and 21 plus 170 to 1. So all of those things, that's where I say it's more, look how it's breaking down, that it's harder to have too much carbon than it is to have too much of the nitrogen. Most people don't put enough carbon in. So that nitrogen is like you've got, 2 cups of milk or water and only 1 egg. That's what you're looking for as far as that sort of that ratio. Hopefully that made sense and was helpful. And I said that if you did not have the capabilities of composting yourself, there are places that will take your compost. So if you've got organics and things, there are places that are looking for your feedstock. Compost Nashville and the compost company will both come and pick it up at your house. You have to take it to Public Works, but Public Works has the ability to take it, and so does Whole Food Market. So the big takeaway here, I'm hoping, is that you don't have to throw it away into the landfill. You've got recycling potential and you've got composting potential. With composting, just like I said, that's one of those things that creates life, and recycling uses a lot of energy to create much the same and a whole lot of transporting back and forth to get it there. And I have found personally that no matter how much compost, I can't compost enough for all the things that I plant. Isn't that handy that Bates has 2 different products to be able to take care of your composting needs? We've got both the magic mushroom compost that we get from an organic mushroom farming facility, and we've got our very own made right here on the property compost that's supernatural. And I've heard some of our landscape specialists that say it is probably one of the most nutrient-rich and dense products that we have. So compost what you can. Find somebody else to compost it if you can't. And if you can't at all, we can still take care of your composting needs. I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but that's all I've got for you. Several different options on what to do with your organics.
We have a question here. Let's see. I have a lot of chicken litter. If I dig a pit and add paper, how long before I could use it? And I presume for smell, need to cover it with plastic?
No, I don't think I'd cover with plastic. You're really going to pop the ammonia on it. If the chicken litter is just the poop, then that is really high and really hot in nitrogen. And yes, you can blend it with newspaper or cardboard. If you've got cardboard, that's going to really help break it down. You've just got to get those cardboard pieces as small as you can. If it's actually the litter, which means that it's in pine shavings, then you can pretty much just add water to that and it's going to break down pretty well by itself. You can certainly add your food scraps to it as well, but chicken manure is one of the really high and high-end stuff, and your biggest thing is once you get it wet and it starts breaking down, if you don't have enough carbon in it, it can really put off an ammonia smell just because of the content itself. I use my chicken litter a lot just because of the amount of pine shavings that I put on the bottom of their coop. Anything else?
Is it a good idea to soak the cardboard to make it lumpy to add to compost?
You don't have to, but that would make it easier to tear if you're going to tear it. When I put it in, I use dry just because I use a box knife to cut it up, because it's just easier for me to use a knife than a whole bunch of pincer grip to tear that cardboard into little pieces. So I don't think you have to. That's one of the things that's one of your dry ingredients in your cake, that you want to have some of that and then let your moisture and a little water added later on just for ease of destruction of your cardboard. But it's not a problem to do it. Just the way I tear it up is a little bit different.
Terry, what's your opinion on compost starters?
Well, that's going to have that seed that I was talking about. So it's going to have the seed and the mycorrhiza and all those things that are in there, those fungal threads. That's basically what you're buying. And so you really shouldn't need it after the first pile that you have processed through to the end. What I used to do with my 3-bin process was I would have one bin that I would be adding to. I'd have another bin that I had stopped adding to so it could cook down. And then I had my 3rd bin. That's what I was feeding out of. So once I fed out of that, I had good stuff on the bottom. that would be the bin that would then become where I put all the new stuff in. So I always had a little starter no matter which bin I was going to. Because once I started putting new there, that meant that my second one was now ready to be pulling out of, and the one that I had emptied, it worked its way through the cycle. So I was only ever putting into one bin at a time, and I was only pulling out of one bin at a time, and the other was in the oven. So the starter is good. If you've got a friend that's already composting, it's cheaper to be able to get a little bit of their stuff that's already cooked and use that as your first add. And you don't have to have it. It's going to do it on its own. It's just quicker if you have some to get it cranked up.
All right. Any thoughts on humanure that was accrued during a urine diverting mechanism, so it's just the solids?
That takes a good bit of heat. I will tell you that at least the compost company will take paper diapers because they have huge windrows that theirs really gets cooked up, and it can really break down all of the bacteria and stuff that is in human manure. I can tell you because I know that there's a little boy out there and a daddy somewhere that is saying, well, can we pee on it? Yes, you can. Urea is really good, and it does not have the pathogens that is a potential in the solids from human solid waste. I know that the water company has an anaerobic digester so all of the wastewater that goes through Nashville then gets fed through an anaerobic digester, and what they end up on the end is a fertilizer, which is really good. In fact, I know that they've been giving it away to farmers in the area for slow release fertilizer, and people are having really good results with it. People mentally have a problem with putting human poop on their gardens and things. It's not human poop by the time it comes out the back end of that anaerobic digester. It is basically sterilized fertilizer that can be used safely. I wouldn't try that at home. This is one of those, stunt things on YouTube that we're professionals, don't try this at home.
All right. I also posted a link in the chat to Music City Gold, which is the product that Metro Water
there you go.
produces. It looks like black pebbles.
Yeah.
It almost looks like charcoal in a way.
Yep.
They say that, if used in a very concentrated way, that there might be a little bit of a wet dog smell, but that's about it.
Yeah.
It is like all of the bacteria has been burned out of it, essentially. Yeah. And you can also sign up. You can look up Tennessee Smart Yards, and that's a certification program. You can actually get a free bag of that if you get your yard certified through that program.
Nice.
Which is through the University of Tennessee Extension Office, which we have here in South Nashville.
Excellent.
Let's see. Let me backtrack. We got some questions here.
Okay.
Cardboard doesn't include milk cartons because they have a bit of shine and color used, correct?
Yes. Those have a wax coating on them, and that's not going to break down for you.
Okay. If I start today, approximately how long until I have decent compost to use in my garden?
It depends on how much feedstock you have. So if you've got some cardboard and some paper, and you've already got some of the nitrogen mix, part of the mix, if you get it out there and get it turned so that it's all sort of a homogeneous blend, then if you keep it turned and you keep that moisture and the temperature up, you can have it in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. So you can start today. It's a matter of if you've only got a little food waste, well, you're going to have to wait until you get a volume to be able to get it enough to have a pile enough to be able to create that heat. So if you're thinking small term, and you just need a little compost, then you could have it probably in 2 weeks.
I imagine throughout the season too, if you were trimming or cutting your plants that weren't diseased, you could just toss them into the pile and keep it going.
Just keep it turned, and just remember, when you add nitrogen, you need to put a quick layer of the carbon, whatever your carbon is that you're using, and then blend it in so it's not just sitting with, layer upon layer. You're wanting to get it blended. You got to stick the cake batter. You got to stick it in a mixer and blend it in order to get that end result.
All right. Let's see. How do you utilize your finished compost? Do you rake it into your beds? Do you store it for feeding transplants?
It depends on how much I have. I use it. I cook it up, and then if I know that I'm not going to need it for a while, then actually I open up my bins, turn it out, and let the chickens pick through it, because you get some really nice soldier fly larvae in there, which are gruesome looking to me, but the chickens love it. And they don't produce some, like prehistoric fly or anything, but they're pretty good larvae, and the chickens really like that. So I turn that out. If I know that I'm going to need it, then I leave it in my bin and I just cover it up so that it's not constantly getting wet, and I save it for when I'm going to need it next. And each year, depending on how much I have, I will top dress my beds. And I'm a person that if the ground's not frozen, then I'm planting something in it. So I always have a need for compost. So I use it a lot. And even if I've got areas that the bed's already planted, if I've used just pine fines for my mulch layer on top, then later in the year, as in like later in the winter season, I'll put some compost down and then put another layer of pine fines on that so that it continually feeds and helps break down that clay. I've got a lot of clay in my yard, which means I've got a lot of water running off, and I put compost and incorporate it in the top couple of inches all year round.
What are your thoughts on dryer sheets that say that they're compostable, like Mrs. Meyer's?
Since it's Mrs. Meyer's, I would say go for it, because that's a pretty trusted company. I would say the same thing for like Seven Brothers, but it's like wipes that say, and they're flushable. Well, the only way they're flushable is if they get all the way out of your particular system in your house to get out to the wastewater. And most wastewater treatment facilities will tell you that that is kind of bogus. So I would be careful with just any brand that says they are, but if they are trusted, sustainably minded companies, then I would say there's not a problem. I would do it myself.
And that probably goes for some of those kind of quasi-plastic utensils and things like that say that they're compostable, but there's...
No, I would trust those because what they're made out of, as a rule, is cornstarch.
Oh.
So they've just got a little extra binder in them, but yes, those break down nicely.
Great. Do you have anything more specific on papers? I work at a printing company and endless supply of printer scraps and things like that. Should I only use uncoated, unprinted, there's no soy ink here, scraps?
To be honest, because I use mine so generally, I don't mind if it's got printing on it. If it's a coated paper, like a little bit glossy, I would not... One, it's not going to break down as quickly, and I think that's just more ink than is worth using for that particular process. It's not that it can't be broken down. I just wouldn't use it on my plants. I know that, unfortunately, the cardboard that we use here that we get things shipped into us on, if it's got any printing or ink on it, we don't use it in our composting because we're organic. So I'm just not that much of a purist, because for me, it's so much more important to not put it in the solid waste stream. Are you tired of that yet? That's just a big thing for me.
Does compost go bad if the pile is left rotating in a composter too long, or is it easily reactivated with new ingredients?
Actually, I don't even think you need to reactivate it. It's still there. It's just churning away. It's not like it goes into stasis. I think the process sort of slows down. And no, what will happen is you will find that it will soon be almost indistinguishable from the most beautiful soil you've ever seen in your life. So I don't think there is any bad compost or that it has an expiration date. I've not experienced a problem with it just sitting for years and then go back and say, I forgot I had this out here. I need to use it now.
I guess you could liken that to the forest floor.
Exactly.
There's years
that
and
leaf
years
litter,
and
it just sits there, and because it's such a slow release process, and because it's just sitting there, those little fungal threads that are in there are just chomping away, living the good life.
How often do you fertilize your beds with the compost?
Because it is slow release, I only do it once a year. If I'm trying to really break up the clay because it's such a nasty clay base, then I will do it as often as twice a year, but you really don't need to. In fact, because I've got horses, I've talked to my grower of my hay, and he said that he has used both synthetic fertilizers and compost, and he said that the results that he got with compost, even though it was a more difficult to spread over an entire field, presented such beautiful results that he will, as quickly as he can, start transitioning off synthetics, because they have to add it again and again throughout the seasons to get further crops, and with compost he didn't have to. So I don't know that there can be too much compost as long as it's well balanced. What you have to be careful of is that if you see that where you've used it, and you've used it for tomatoes, for example, and you're getting this huge, beautiful green plant and no tomatoes, that means it's too high in nitrogen, because nitrogen is what feeds the leaves. So you need to balance that out a little bit, and you need to get that phosphate, that phosphorus, that center number. If you're looking at a fertilizer, you need to get more elements, those nutrients, to support that fruit and flower growth. So I don't think you can overdo it. You can if it's not a balanced blend.
Would you use coated cardboard for weed block in beds?
I have. The biggest pain that I've found is that I didn't take the tape off because I was being lazy. And that meant as it broke down, I had nasty strips of tape that I had to deal with later on. So
I imagine staples stick around too.
Yes, they will. But it will do. The problem with that weed block is you have to leave enough space for the water to get through. You still have to have water saturating in to get to your plants. So as long as you've left enough room for the water to get into your soil and water your plants, then you'll be okay.
Awesome. What is the ratio of compost for like a 4x6x2 raised bed? And I guess we mean volume of compost to
compared to the soil. If it's a raised bed, and it's already been filled, like with our garden blend, then you can top dress it with like an inch of compost on the top. And that'll be all you have to do for the year. If you lose volume because it's just been rained down and it's just become a little compressed, then you can either simply add more garden, which has compost already in it, and it has the mycorrhiza already in it, as well as some pine fines to help with drainage, as well as the topsoil. But if you're just looking to jump the nutrients, about an inch is all that you need to be able to top dress it with to give it that boost.
Okay. And what are compostable items to add phosphorus?
That was one of the things that I was not sure. I know like the eggshells in particular are the calcium elements that you need for things that are in the nightshade family, like tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, things like that. I am honestly not sure exactly what would add phosphorus, but I can look that up for you.
Okay. And it looks like that's all the questions we have.
All right.
So
Good.
Oh, wait. Nope. We got one more.
More.
Best time to top dress with compost, now or before planting?
Actually, I've heard somebody say that it takes a couple of weeks for those nutrients to really get, into and distributed through the soil. So I would do it a couple of weeks before you start planting, just to let it start releasing those nutrients so it's not just in that top inch. Now, if you're planting seeds, I don't know that would be all that bad of a thing, because that top inch is where your seeds are going to be sitting, and you're going to really juice them up as they start germinating. But otherwise, I would get on it a little bit earlier than when you're going to start setting your plants.
Great. Okay. I'm going to put my face on here. Alicia said, so if you only do it once in a season, do you just keep turning all year, or does it fill up? The bin, she means.
It can fill up. I would say that because as it keeps composting, it gets smaller and smaller. And so when it's sort of freshly cooked, you're going to have more volume. As the season wears on, like over the winter, it's not going to be as hot. So even though you're adding, it's not going to compost as quickly. So it will, if it's already composted and you've already used out and you just have, what's left over, you'll find that it just sort of shrinks. And so keep adding, and that becomes the seed stock for whatever next you start using.
Let's see. Do you bokashi, or do you know about bokashi?
I do not. What's bokashi?
I just looked it up now. It's bokashi composting is an anaerobic process that relies on inoculated bran to ferment kitchen waste.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah. So
well, and you can also do hugelkultur, which is sort of a different way of composting and planting. And I could probably do a small section on hugelkultur. It's just using a lot more wood, like, trunks and branches and things, to be the base of your composting pile. And that allows it to continue to rot and to add the nutrients to the bottom of the process while still allowing air to get in. And that's something that you can sort of take a look at. There's your homework.
Yeah.
Boot camp people.